Dear ladies and gentlemen, let's start our next session. Let's now take a closer look at our first key topic at ITB Berlin Convention this year, overtourism. The massive increase in conflicts in tourism hotspots shows that things can continue as they have until now. Initial experiences of heavily affected destinations reveal which approaches were successful and which weren't. Can smart technologies and the setting of quotas effectively mitigate overtourism? How can pricing be used to better manage demand, given time and capacity constraints? Will we soon need completely new strategies for tourism destinations? The latest McKinsey study, Coping with Success, Managing Overcrowding in Tourism Destinations, which was commissioned by the WTTC, takes a look at affected tourism regions and provides recommendations for actions. Our next speakers are Gloria Guevara Manzo and Margaux Constantin. Ms. Gloria Guevara has been a speaker on our stage before. We highly appreciate her commitment to the ITB Berlin Convention. She now is the President and CEO of World Travel and Tourism Council, WTTC. Prior to her appointment, she served as Secretary of Tourism for Mexico and CEO of the Mexican Tourism Board, acting as Minister in the cabinet of President Calderón. Mrs. Guevara, when you were appointed as WTTC CEO and President, you said, "This is a critical time for travel and tourism and the 292 million people whose job depend on it. Maybe this is true also because of overtourism?" This is our question. Our second speaker is Margaux Constantin. Margaux Constantin is an associate principal in McKinsey Dubai's office. Her work with McKinsey addresses tourism and entertainment sector growth strategies for destinations. She co-authored the report on overcrowding with the WTTC, articulating the key steps for destinations to become more sustainable. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start our presentation, we are interested to learn more about the audiences, about yours opinion regarding overtourism. As you might know, we have a live voting system here in this hall with remote control devices attached to your seats. Please take them and press number 1, 2, 3, or 4 when I show you the questions. Can I see the questions, please, for our live voting now? Dear audience, our question is, do you think we'll be able to solve the overtourism problem in the next 10 years? If you think no, the continuing growth of tourism will only make it worse, then please press 1. If you think no, but overtourism will only remain a temporary problem for some regions, please press 2. If you think yes, we will be able to manage overtourism more efficiently, please press 3. And if you think the overtourism problem is overrated, then please press 4. Ladies and gentlemen, please vote now. The majority, 37.3%, think no, but overtourism will only remain a temporary problem for some regions. Okay, but we think these some regions should have better solutions than now. We are very much interested to hear the presentation of Mrs. Guevara. Mrs. Guevara, please, the stage is yours. And immediately after the presentation of Mrs. Guevara, Constantin Margaux will continue. Welcome at ITB, Mrs. Guevara.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Thank you for the invitation. It is an honor to be here and a pleasure for WTTC. But let me see some hands. Who's familiar with WTTC here, please? That's good. I mean, probably half of the audience. So who is WTTC? There are two organizations in the world, UNWTO Are you guys familiar with UNWTO? Represents a little bit over 150 governments, is United Nations World Tourism Organization, and the WTTC, which is the World Travel and Tourism Council. We represent the private sector. This is the body that represents the global private sector. We have more than 100 CEOs from around the world, global companies. They're our members. And they define pretty much the agenda across all geographies of the topics that we will cover in the industry and the sector. Now, we do a lot of research, 185 countries. We look at exactly what is the contribution of travel and tourism. Very interesting, because if you look at travel and tourism, we have the direct impact. For instance, who's here from outside of Germany staying in a hotel? Most of you? That's good. When you spend in that hotel, pay your bill, that's a direct contribution to travel and tourism. What about the orange juice that you had this morning? Is that direct or indirect? That's indirect. Because whoever produces those oranges, perhaps have not been able to sell them if the hotel wasn't there, correct? But that's an indirect contribution. What about the employees in the hotel? Their money, where they spend? That's induced. So when you consider those three and we measure that, that's how we know the contribution for travel and tourism worldwide. And travel and tourism worldwide contributes to 10.2% of the GDP. 10% of the GDP globally. That's much more than manufacturing, more than health. Healthcare is like 9%. So it's a very important sector, travel and tourism. 300 million jobs, 1 in every 10 jobs, 30% of the exports, and roughly $800 billion in investments. These numbers are from last year. The year before, we are about to come up with the new numbers. Now, what's very interesting about travel and tourism and what we monitor is that despite all the challenges, despite all the issues, this sector or these industries within the sector are very resilient, and we keep growing. And the growth is an average of 4%. Now, what's also interesting is that we're forecasting, well, we hear that a lot of jobs are going to go away with the automation and a lot of things that are going to happen in the next 10 years. In travel and tourism, you will see 100 million new jobs, which is, I think, something very important. The other thing is that last year, according to the UNWTO, we saw 1.2 billion international arrivals, and that number is expected to grow to 1.8. That's like 50% more. A lot of people crossing borders. And to tell you the truth, that's going to be a challenge if we consider the current processes, the current infrastructure. So we need to prepare for that growth. That's very important. Now, let's look at where people are traveling. Very interesting. City arrivals are growing the most. Here you have some percentages of the growth that we have seen in the past 10 years. We see a lot of people going to the cities. 34% Berlin, you have there 40% Prague. It's interesting because some of these are first-time travelers, some of those are travelers that they're second time or very frequent travelers like Germans. They like to travel a lot, or Europeans. But a lot is still going to cities. At the same time, we see some challenges. Have you seen these images? Some of these in the media, that where they say it's good to have travelers, but at the same time, it's bringing some challenges to some of these destinations, some specific cities, because it seems that people are going to the same destinations. And that's why we say, okay, this is a concern, this is a challenge, we're responsible, but let's find out what's going on. And last year, we partnered with McKinsey, the consulting firm. And we work with McKinsey on a study. Let's talk about what is called overtourism or overcrowding, and as you pointed out in your question. So what is it? You will hear from Margaux more details, but basically what we understand is that there's no standard definition, which means that it means different things in different places. But something that is very clear is that for someone, for instance, in Barcelona, There might be a job opportunity, but for someone else, it's a hassle, it's a problem. And we need to deal with that, and we need to understand what's going on and how do we fix it, because it's something that is happening. At the same time, we might see that in Barcelona, a lot of people are in the beach, but in the same city, we have some destinations that they don't even have tourists, like in this case. So what is going on? What is happening here? Why do we see this? Because 70% of the growth that we're seeing is coming to 20 countries, okay? Because these 20 countries are capturing a lot of these new travelers. And when we do a lot of analysis. We look at the millennials, we look at the new middle class. We are trying to understand what is going on. But at the end of the day, 70% of the growth is coming to these 20 countries. That's good news, that we also see a lot of countries growing little by little. The question is, how the successful destinations can cope with success. Because a lot of people depend on tourism. One case that you hear a lot in the news, for instance, Barcelona. I can tell you that in Barcelona, I was there in the 80s, first time ever that I went to Barcelona. And a lot of you look younger, probably, that you didn't go to Barcelona in that time. But I remember that they told me, don't go to Ramblas, don't go here, don't go there. It was a great city, very high unemployment, I felt very insecure. A couple of years after, I went back, and it was a huge transformation. Barcelona, local authorities and private sector did a wonderful job, and this is another city. So how can they cope with this success? How do they manage this success of overcrowding? And that's exactly what we wanted to talk to you and understand, first of all, what is that overcrowding? What is going on? How do we define that challenge? The challenge, let's understand what's happening. First of all, some communities are feeling that they are not part of what's going on. They feel alienated or not part of this. At the same time, when you see all these volumes of tourists, even the tourists might not be enjoying the experience. The other thing that we're seeing is that the infrastructure is overloaded. You might have a country that has 40 million citizens and is receiving 65 million. How do you manage that? It's a lot of people visiting, so it's an overloading the infrastructure. Then in some cases might be damaging the nature, and then of course the cultural assets. So it is a challenge. And as I say, there is no one solution in this case. There is a challenge, and at the end of the day, we're going to continue growing. We believe from WTTC and from the leaders of travel and tourism in the private sector, first of all, we have to put things in perspective. Each destination is unique, okay? At the end of the day, tourism is bringing opportunities. We create jobs and prosperity, but it is clear that it has to be a win-win. It has to be good for the person that works for tourism, and it's the main activity, and that's the reason that they have a good life and a good opportunity, but it has to be also a good opportunity and a good solution for the local communities. At the end of the day, that's what it has to be. Now, we have done a lot of analysis, and as I say, Margaux will give you a lot of details on the analysis, but it boils down from my perspective and the perspective of WTTC in a couple of things that I believe we can do better. The first one is the solutions, they require a long-term planning. It was very interesting to me to see the question that he had, the 10 years, because 10 years is a long-term planning. At the end of the day, I have to tell you, and it was mentioned, the Minister of Tourism from Mexico, a lot of times you plan short-term, because the politicians, they go and come, and they want to see short-term results. They want to demonstrate that we create jobs short-term at the end of the day, right? But that's when you have to engage with the private sector, and that's when you have to engage with the communities. That's what we call PPC. It's not only the public sector responsible for this. The private sector has to be part of the solution, and the community has to be part of the solution. And together, they have to plan for the best for that destination. They need to consider, okay, these are the needs. This is where we see ourselves in 10 years or 5 years. Let's make a plan that works for everyone. So planning is crucial. And that's up to the local citizens and the private sector to make sure that they engage with the different levels of the government. Because even with the government, we have the local government, the state or regional, and then, of course, the federal government. Then we need to look about the product. How do we diversify? How do we move some people away from one case to another way, from one city to another city? Because the reality is that you go to destinations, and I don't know about you, but I have been in destinations, and it's exactly the same tour, exactly the same places to see. There is no product development, and we need to do that product development. We need to move people around. Let me give you one example. In my time in the government in Mexico, perhaps you never heard about this, but we wanted to diversify. We were promoting Cancun, sun and beach. And suddenly, we discovered the end of the Maya calendar. And we came up with the Maya route that was talking about the end of the Maya calendar. Have you heard about the Maya calendar ever? That was an initiative that we created to diversify and move some people outside of Cancun to Tulum, to Riviera, to Yucatan, to other destinations and have some other things to promote, the culture, the adventure, learn more about the Mayas, museums. That's product diversification, and that's something that the governments do very well with the private sector. Then encourage people to visit different places at different things at different times. This is another one that I think is very important in terms of product. Technology. Margaux will give you a couple of examples, but there's a lot of great technology out there that is being used today. She'll talk about Amsterdam. Very interesting case. And also the successful cases about involving communities. This is a photo, supposed to be Miami Beach. That's Fisher Island. Miami Beach is on the other side. I was living there for 4 years. It's the largest home port in the world. I don't know if you're aware of that. They have a lot of cruises. They come, the largest home port in the world. And the second one is very close, Fort Lauderdale. It's a pretty big destination. The Miami airport receives sometimes more international arrivals than JFK in New York. Pretty big. I lived in Miami Beach for 4 years, never ever felt overcrowded. Never ever felt over tourism. Why is that? Because of the engagement of the community, because they use the technology to communicate. Whenever we were going to have, for instance, the Memorial Weekend, they were communicating to the neighbors, this is what's going on, in 3 weeks or 4 weeks, this is going to happen, be prepared, take your precautions, and people were part of that. They wanted to build a new convention center, we had to vote and decide yes or no. So there are things to learn from other cases. That doesn't mean that this is the best. Again, every case is unique, every case is different. We need to understand every case. But at the end of the day, it's up to us to be part of the solution, because we have two options here. Do nothing about it and let them talk bad about tourism, or take advantage of the opportunities and the jobs that we can continue creating and making sure that everyone is enjoying tourism, not only the visitors, but also the local people. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It is a pleasure for me to be here, and now I'm going to turn it to Margaux. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria, for the introduction. We'll just wait until this comes up. So, as Gloria mentioned, the reason that we started looking into this problem and started this report is the stark realization that 70% of visitors are concentrated in just 20 countries. And actually, if you look at the top 10, it's almost 50%. And so that's quite starking, but then we had big hopes in the millennials, because we've all heard, you know, the millennials, they're different, they travel everywhere, they want to go off the beaten track, and they're going to go to all these unexplored places no one has ever been to. Well, unless France and Spain are these like off the beaten track, that seems to be happening a bit more on their Instagram accounts than in real life. Because if we look at at least at these numbers that are forecasting arrivals by 2020, the growth keeps being in the top 20 and even more so the top countries. So that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon, despite the best intentions of our millennials. So, being consultants, we started doing lots of analysis. That's what we do, right? So we looked at the data from 68 different cities. We did in-depth benchmarking of 20 different destinations to try to understand this problem. And we did what we typically do in those cases is we decided we need to develop a framework because we love frameworks. So Gloria hinted on this framework briefly, but to give you a bit more details, we've realized that it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all, and that different destinations face this challenge in a different way. So there's broadly 4 archetypes that we identified. The first one, which we discussed a little bit now, is alienating local residents who feel that they get really ousted of their own city. I mean, if you take the city of Venice, the population has halved in 30 years. That's pretty concerning. Then there are also people who just get a very degraded experience. They go see something that they thought was going to be unique, and the experience is not quite in their dreams. I'm sure you've all seen the pictures of the person who takes a picture of the person who's taking a picture of the person who's taking a picture of the Mona Lisa. That's not exactly the way that people were hoping to experience the Mona Lisa. Then you have places who have huge infrastructure issues. In some villages in New Zealand, you have 20 times the number of visitors than the local population. How is the water, sewage, road infrastructure supposed to cope with this? The fourth archetype is damage to nature. So you've all heard about coral reefs, islands, natural sites that are getting degraded by overvisitation. And so the very thing that is making the tourists come might not be here 10, 20 years from now, or 5 years from now, for that matter. And then you have a few places that are just cultural heritage crumbling. There are parts of the Chinese wall that is crumbling. The Machu Picchu has set now a limit of 2,500 visitors per day, but it's still struggling coping with the 2,500 visitors per day. So we had a framework and we were quite happy with that. But of course, we felt we needed data and KPIs, because that's what we like to do in our job. We like to have KPIs on everything. So okay, we need to figure out some KPIs for each of these archetypes. And so what we did is we built a tool, which is basically an easy self-diagnosis tool with readily available data. You don't need to start running your own survey. It's publicly available information. And you can quickly figure out as a destination where you stand. Are you at risk of overcrowding? Are you far? What kind of metrics do you need to measure? These metrics are not perfect because we use what was here. But it gives a first step for that conversation, a bit of a data-driven way. So I'm sure for those of you who have kids, first thing you do when your kid is sick is, rather than calling the doctor, you ask Google. I do that with my kids. I don't know if that's the right thing to do. This is the Google very quick answer to what is your overcrowding issue. And so what we did, because we love data so much, we also love fancy, cool charts. So we thought we'll put that data in very cool spider charts to really get a sense of what the challenge is. So I'll try to take you around this circle. But what we did for 68 cities globally is we looked at what is their overall tourism context in terms of how big is tourism in their economy, how fast are arrivals growing. In terms of alienating local residents, we looked at the density of tourism and the tourism intensity. And I'll go through those metrics in a minute. We looked at the tourist experience, how good or bad were the reviews on TripAdvisor of the main sites. For the infrastructure, we looked at seasonality and the concentration of attraction in one place. We also looked at pollution, and we looked at how big are historical sites in the overall mix of the destination. So is this a varied destination in terms of experience, or is it overly focused on historical sites. And so for each of those KPIs, across the 68 cities, we try to figure out, are you a top 20%? Or are you a bottom 20%? Are you a first quartile or a bottom quartile? And so the way to read this chart is the more color you have and the more dark blue you are, the sort of bigger the potential challenge, because it means you're top quartile. So now, what kind of metrics did we use? I won't bore you with all the numbers, but I think there's a few interesting ones that are worth calling out. So of course, we looked at the tourism share in GDP and employment, and you see here what kind of numbers for the 68 cities are top quintile versus fifth quintile, right? So what is the top 20% number versus the bottom 20% number? We looked at how fast tourism arrivals are growing. We also looked at number of visitors per square kilometer. And that was a fun one, because how do you define the area of a tourism destination? In some cases, you have destinations where everyone is packed within the old city behind tiny, tiny walls, the size of a shoe, yeah? And in other cities, they spread across the entire city. So it's a bit difficult to compare. So we actually looked specifically at the number of arrivals divided by the square kilometer that are within the top 20 attractions on TripAdvisor. If you take the top 20 attractions on TripAdvisor, you look where they are on the map, that gives you an area. It was actually the idea of a very smart colleague of mine who's in the room today, which I thought was a really interesting one. And if you look at the numbers, it's actually quite mind-blowing. So the top 20% destinations on that metric have almost 1 million person per square kilometer of that area every year. This is not a small number. No wonder that people who live here feel a little bit sort of overcrowded. And if you're the fifth quintile, it's actually less than 75,000 people. So it's such a massive variance, even within the 68 most visited cities in the world. The variance you see is huge, which goes back to this notion that it's not a one-size-fits-all, and it's important to use data to really figure out where you stand in this equation. We also, of course, looked at number of visitors per residence, right? Some cities have more than 5 times the number of visitors over a year than the residents, not even taking into account seasonality issues. We looked at poor and terrible reviews of top attractions in TripAdvisors. We looked at seasonality. Another one I really liked was to look at the share of reviews that are concentrated in the top 5 attractions of a place. So if you go on TripAdvisor, thank TripAdvisor for all this data. It's like a wealth of things to explore. Could spend the whole day doing that. But if you take the top 5 attractions and look how many reviews do they have over all the attractions that are on TripAdvisor in that city, the top quintile has more than 36%. Some destinations had 80% of reviews concentrated in just 5 attractions. And these are not cities that have 3 things to visit, yeah? They're like the 68 most visited cities in the world. So I thought that was also fairly mind-blowing. And we looked at pollution and at the share of historical sites. So now, then we created cool charts, because as I said, we love doing cool charts. This is, who thinks that the chart on this side is Barcelona? Raise your hand. Who thinks that this is New York? So roughly half-half. So this one is Barcelona, and this one is New York. I think what's interesting when you look at those is Barcelona, you clearly see a fuller map than the one from New York. I think you also see a couple of challenges around seasonality, the density of tourism. So this notion that all the tourists are packed within a very small area of the city. The concentration of attraction. And so then it's not surprising to hear that some of the residents are not very happy with the situation. In New York, on the other hand, what you see is actually a fairly light chart, but very high density of tourism. And so while I don't think New York necessarily sees itself as a place that has huge over-tourism issues the way that Barcelona sees itself that way, it could be interesting for the city of New York seeing this to say, hey, maybe we should start running a survey with our residents every year to figure out how they feel about this tourism issue. Because the big thing with over-tourism is you want to address it before it's there. Once it's there, it's a bit too late. So you want to keep a pulse of your citizens and how they feel towards tourism. One example that's not here, but quite interesting, is Chongqing in China, which I don't think I pronounced quite well, because I actually didn't even know this place existed until I did this report. But it's actually much, much more busy than the Barcelona chart. So it's first quintile in almost every dimension of this chart. And so this is where this diagnostic becomes interesting, because it really helps you put a fact base behind some beliefs, impressions, issues, etc. So we thought, okay, it's nice to give you sort of the Google answer to self-diagnosis and quick facts, but we should also tell you what kind of remedies you should use. And so we tried to put together a bit of a toolkit of the kind of things that destinations can consider, depending on the archetype under which you fall. There's a lot more in the report than what I'll share now. I'll just share a couple of examples. But I want to make sure that we leave you with a bit of a toolkit of things that you want to consider. And data is number one for sure. Maybe partially because we're consultants, we love data so much, but without having the right data, it's hard to know what the issue is. So there are some interesting examples in New Zealand. Since late 2015, they run actually every quarter, a survey with residents to figure out their sentiment towards tourism. And so 90% of New Zealanders actually support tourism and think it's a good thing for the country. But what you also see is an increasing percentage of the ones who think that international visitors put too much pressure on the country. And that number in less than 6 months went from 18% of people surveyed to 36%. So if you're not having those tools in place to communicate with your communities and get their feedback, you're not going to find out those things and how quickly they can evolve. So here there's about we have 5 different solutions that I wanted to talk about today. There's a lot more in the report. Definitely encourage you to read the report. But maybe just starting with a few ideas. So spreading visitors, there are some tactics that can be used around balancing seasonalities or helping spread visitors over a bigger geographical coverage, whether at a country level or at a city level. And Gloria mentioned a few examples. Here are some of the examples I like. So Venice. I've actually been going to Venice every 2 years since I'm 10 years old. So I've been going there really a lot. In my family, we don't celebrate Christmas, because that's not but we celebrate the Venice Biennale. So that for sure will always go to the Venice Biennale. And for everyone who's been to Venice, the triangle between San Marco, Rialto, and Accademia is not maybe exactly the romantic idea you've had of going to Venice, and can be more overwhelming than actually going around the corridors of the ITB here. It's a fairly intense experience. And so that's why I love this detourism initiative. It's a marketing push that is going on social media, magazines, that is trying to encourage people to see other sides of Venice. It's actually quite big, and there's plenty of things to see. And I think if you see those pictures of Venice at the top, it's not necessarily the pictures you have of Venice. It's not the picture that we saw in the previous presentation either. It's a different side of Venice. And they've also trained concierges and tour operators in what they call the detourism itinerary, and have magazines published every month. Another example which is interesting is using data and technology. Amsterdam is a bit at the forefront of experimenting with data and technology, is now trying to nudge visitor behavior by experimenting with publishing on their website the live queue times at the main attractions. So you know, okay, I'm not going to go right now because it's 2.5-hour queue. I'll try to go later when there's a little bit less people. They also want to try to create an app that will send push notification to users to warn them, hey, you seem to be heading in that direction, just not the direction you want to be heading into right now. So with data and technology and mobile phone, there's lots we can do in terms of channeling people beyond just marketing, but real time. The bottom example is the North Island Initiative, which was all about promoting this beautiful route, which is called the North Coast 500 route, and encouraging visitors to go along that route and explore it, rather than going to some of the main sites. Now, there's lots that we can do in terms of pricing. So we saw lots of destinations playing with pricing to balance better supply and demand, whether through taxes and fees, and Bhutan is a well-known example there that I won't go in details on, but there's also price segmentation, dynamic real-time pricing, or just charging people what this is really costing you. So some of the examples that I liked is the Eiffel Tower is now financing a 300 million euro renovation by increasing its ticket price by 50%. And I think a lot of sites shy away from, when they need to do major renovation work and major investments, of charging it onto the visitors. But if you're suffering from sort of overcrowding at that site, it's actually a great opportunity to do that. Another example I like, maybe because I've been living in Dubai for more than 10 years now, is Burj Khalifa. So Burj Khalifa is the tallest tower in the world. And you need to book your ticket on the website. And depending on which floor you go to, and what time of the day, and what time of the year, and the seasonality you have, I don't know how many prices there. But between the cheapest ticket and the most expensive ticket, there's more than 4-time difference, whether you want to go at sunrise, at sunset, etc. You can actually also buy the ticket on site, but it's literally like 10x what you would buy it online. Yeah? So if you're really sort of a lazy, not price-sensitive traveler, you can do it, but it's going to cost you. The context in which Burj Khalifa did it was security reason. This is the tallest tower in the world. They cannot have they cannot have overcrowding, period, for safety reasons. They had to do this. But I think there's lots to learn from that example in terms of how we manage sites and destinations and how we can keep these places open to everyone on all budgets, but just also get the money from the people who are willing to spend more. There are even restaurants in London that have started experimenting with cheaper prices during weekday evenings for the same menu. And so all this real-time discounting, I think, is going to become a much bigger thing in the coming years. Similar to the Eiffel Tower, the Pantheon in Rome is now considering putting an entrance fee in place to be able to pay for all the maintenance costs that they have from visitors. So lots and lots that can be done in terms of pricing. In terms of regulation, so accommodation supply is a big topic. Obviously, once you don't have hotel rooms anymore, you're not going to get new visitors. That was until home sharing became a very big thing. And so that massively increased the hypothetical supply of hotel rooms that you have in those destinations. So lots and lots of destinations, as we all know, are experimenting with different types of regulations for home sharing, especially the European cities. I think one example that I find more interesting than the European cities is what Maldives is doing. So in the Maldives, obviously, majority of visitors go to these very luxurious hotels. Lots of the value add for the country goes out of the country. And they're trying to use home sharing regulation to encourage visitors to go to less well-known islands and actually stay with locals in home sharing type of arrangements. So it can also be a very effective vehicle for certain destinations to spread the visitors, as opposed to over-concentrate the visitors. So again, that's why we constantly say this is not a one-size-fits-all. It's not that you have a list of things that you can do and that they apply to you in the same way. Limiting access and activities. Increasingly, destinations have had to block access to sites or to certain activities to limit the risk of overcrowding. I'm sure that many of you have heard of this beach in Thailand. If you haven't, it's The Beach. The Beach as in the beach from the movie The Beach. And so because of the movie, all of a sudden, everyone wanted to go there. not only did the island suffer from massive overcrowding and environmental damage to both the mountains and the reef, but also people wanted to do really a lot of really dumb stuff there. So they actually had to close access to the island to visitors altogether. In Galapagos, the islands were placed in the UNESCO's danger list in 2007. The number of visitors had almost quadrupled in 15 years. The number of residents had doubled, super unsustainable. So they issued new regulations to do two things: cap the total length of stay that you can have in one trip, so you cannot stay more than a certain amount of time. And within that time, you're not allowed to go twice to the same site. So they're also making sure that people are spreading across the Galapagos Islands. In Dubrovnik, they capped the number of visitors per day to 8,000. The mayor has committed to even half that number, and that's in a context where you have lots of cruise visitors as well. So the challenge is in how do you enforce that, and how do you really monitor it? This is where, again, data and technology comes into play. So they're using all the video surveillance cameras that are in the city to try to monitor the actual number of people that are here. You can also use infrared cameras, basically the same technologies that are being used in museums. You can start using in cities to really monitor the flow of people and prevent people from coming. Then you have some destinations that are banning specific activities. So for example, Amsterdam has banned issuing more licenses to souvenir shops in the city centers, because people also need grocery stores and local community-related stuff that residents need. They don't only need souvenir shops. They've also banned certain sort of bike, drinking activities, etc. So there's a bunch of activities that now you cannot do in the city center of Amsterdam anymore. And so last but not least, funding. How do you make sure that you can fund destinations properly to manage overcrowding situations? The New Zealand example is quite an interesting one, because local governments pay for infrastructure and infrastructure improvements. But when you're a tiny village, you have very few taxpayers. How are you supposed to pay for now the 1 million visitors who come every year in your 10,000 people city? It just doesn't work. You can't pay for the road, water, sewage, etc. So what the government did is they created an infrastructure fund, pulling in money from the regions that have a bigger taxpayer base. And there's now a fund of $17 million available to finance infrastructure development in smaller areas and smaller municipalities that have a smaller taxpayer base. Iceland in 2012 established the Tourist Site Protection Fund. And that fund is meant to carry out restoration and maintenance work of different tourism-related natural sites. They're also spending money in developing new sites for visitors that are currently less visited. And in October 2016, 87% of the population approved those kinds of measures. So it has really strong support from the community. On a completely different note, Rotterdam worked on crowdfunding campaigns. So they wanted to renovate a certain bridge to connect better different parts of the cities for bicycles and pedestrians and visitors. And so they crowdfunded it under the I Make Rotterdam campaign. And that's how they ended up crowdfunding the renovation of this. It was contributed by residents, but also by tourists. So thinking about how you can finance those measures is fairly critical. So I think these are just a few of the ideas in the toolkit. You'll find way more ideas and facts and data in the report. And it's really just the beginning of the conversation. So we're looking at what others have been doing. We're looking at the data that we can gather. But this is just an early playbook of options at this stage. I think what we really need to take this to scale is destinations need to build a very solid foundation for data and start tracking and measuring some of the things that are important for them. They also need to engage their stakeholders, as we discussed, private sector, public sector, communities, and identify sustainable sources of funding. And so only then can they really create a bit of a long-term plan and horizon to manage and spread their visitors and spread the wealth that come with it. Thank you.